Hi, I'm going to be reviewing your admissions portfolio, starting first with just some general comments and thoughts about sort of the work as a whole, and then moving into more specific and detailed critique about each individual piece, sort of just telling you what I think is really working about this portfolio, while also giving you some thoughts about maybe what you could try to improve or focus more on as you bring this up to an even more finished level. I think what's really working about it in a big way is that I get a clear sense of your own personality and perspective in all of the pieces. So in your artist statement, you talk about being influenced by people like Tim Burton, Stephen King, Edgar Allan Poe, and I think that kind of sort of gothic, macabre, kind of dark sensibility really comes across in this portfolio, and I think that's a very strong element of it, and definitely something that college admissions sort of advisors are looking for in an art school portfolio, because I think they really want to get a sense of who you are in particular and what your interests are. So that's a great element to have. The one thing I would say about that, though, is you want to make sure that you don't get too caught up in one thing, because at this stage of your sort of artistic career, you want to be more open and you want to explore different media, but also different subject matter. So while it's great that you have this strong sort of focus on the macabre and these sort of darker elements, I'd love to see you sort of push that in as many different directions as possible. You mentioned Tim Burton. Tim Burton is someone who, of course, has this interest in horror and that kind of genre stuff, but at the same time, he's someone who also has a strong sense of humor. And, often that sense of humor is very dark, this kind of black comedy. Within his specific focus and within his own interests, kind of move from one end of the spectrum to the other. And so that's something I'd like to see you push even further. I do see, maybe not humor in all these pieces, although I do think that's there too, but I do see some playfulness, especially when I look at these figure studies where there's so much movement and a little bit more color, and you're using the color in a very particular way, create a hierarchy, really work compositionally to give us a sense of the playfulness with these figures. And I think that is something that I would love to see more of in these pieces, as well as you experimenting a little bit more with different types of media. About half of this portfolio is in black and white, and I think if you really want to push it even further, I would like to see you do even more color works. The examples you do include, you're sort of working on photographs. It feels a little less like it's yours and a little less like something that you were playing with, I think, because of that strong photographic element. So maybe I'd like to see you do some of these drawn pieces, maybe work with color that way. I think it's easy to get intimidated by paint. You're such a strong drafts person that maybe that's an avenue to explore, to sort of think about the way you could use pastels or sort of Prismacolor crayons to bring out color in a sort of drawn piece and not worry about paint, although you do have some really strong mixed media work in this portfolio. In general, I think what I'm really responding to is that in addition to your really clear and specific sensibility, you also have a lot of technique down. So that's a great place to start. Looking at this first image, one thing that's really striking me about it is your composition. I think this kind of really dynamic and dramatic perspective that we're looking at this figure sort of from almost a worm's eye point of view up at this portrait, that feels really striking. And I think it gives a really clear sense of atmosphere and mood in this piece. There's a real clear sense also because of the way you use the eyes of the portrait, sort of directing the viewer's attention off of the page and sort of out of frame. This kind of gives us this sense of foreboding that there's something outside of our view that the figure can see, but that we cannot, kind of troubling thought. And I think it's really goes well with the way that you're using the charcoal, even just texturally, looking at the kind of energetic strokes in the hair, a strong sense of one light source, a very dynamic light source that's playing across the face, creating a lot of chiaroscuro shadows. That's something that I think is very successful about this image as well, is that tonal range. So there's a lot going on in this piece that is extremely successful. I would say the one thing that is maybe a little less successful is that I have at least a confused understanding of the torso of this figure and the way that is working in this piece. It feels like you're exaggerating the proportions a great deal. The torso takes up a lot of space and the head takes up relatively little. In large part, I think this is because you have very consciously and smartly chosen to foreshorten the proportions, once again, to play into that dramatic perspective. As a consequence, and especially because you have the hair covering so much of the torso, it makes this piece a little confusing. There is this pattern, this kind of striped pattern on the clothing, it seems, that also matches this kind of pattern you're using on a more expressionistic level in the background. And I think that definitely makes things a little hard to read, and to some extent I can almost view this as kind of a floating head with hair sort of flying off of it. That could be a really disturbing kind of image and something to explore, but it doesn't read as quite so intentional at this moment. So I would really focus on trying to differentiate more between that background and the just the print on the fabric in the foreground. Once again, a really strong skill with drawing and that sort of media. Here, this appears to be you working in pencil, and what's really interesting to me is, once again, the hair is a real focal point, but this gives me a strong sense of your ability to use different marks, because here the hair is very tightly rendered. I would say almost too rendered, but I think you're really doing a good job with it here in that it almost feels kind of graphic. Like, it doesn't feel like you're overly observing a photograph necessarily, which is a problem I see in a lot of high school, college admissions portfolios. In this image, I think you're using it almost in a way that's kind of like a pattern, and it's getting very kind of graphic, and I think that approach is really cool here, and it really works with the rest of the image. I look at the brain as well, and that feels like it's in the same sort of ballpark in terms of being a little bit more stylized, in this kind of nice balance between naturalism and a more graphic, simplistic approach. And I love the repetition of the handles on the knives sticking into the brain. That concept kind of speaks to this, again, this macabre sensibility, but also I think a little bit more of the playful side of your interests, and I think that is something that you could play up even more. A weakness of this image is actually the composition, especially looking at the previous image, which is so dramatic in terms of its perspective. This one is very dead on, straightforward, but you're also not really cropping in on what is the true focal point of this subject matter, which are the knives and the brain. That's sort of just barely almost touching the edge of the paper, and it's sort of crammed into this top right corner of the composition. So I'd like to see you give that a little bit more room and breadth, move the figure's head down a little bit more, and sort of keep the handles of the blades even just in the center of the composition. I mean, that is usually kind of boring choice to put the focal point in the center of the image, but I think I'd much rather see that than having the figure kind of awkwardly placed at the edge of the paper. This next image, it seems like you're moving a little bit more into mixed media, so that's exciting. Looking at the way you are sort of adding a kind of white ink in addition to a black ink on top of the rest of this drawing, it seems like you're using ink wash in a way that's very similar to your charcoal drawing, and so that's really exciting to see, but it's also great to see that you are still taking advantage of the media, getting this kind of drop texture to articulate the strands of hair. This is a very haunting image. Once again, I think a weakness of this, though, is the composition. It feels a little strange to me, the way the character is sort of sitting just on the edge of the frame. It's sort of an awkward tangent, so that's something I would pay closer attention to. This skeleton piece is very strong. I love the focus on the spine and sort of the rib cage and the way you've sort of elongated those proportions and, again, kind of overlapped different parts of the skeleton in a way that is sort of stylized while still having the kind of more naturalistic and sort of very detailed shading that I've seen in your other work. I love also this sort of grainy texture you're getting on the bones. If I'm sort of looking at the image as a whole, it does feel very graphic, stylized, just a lot of sharp blacks and whites, very crisp outlines on the bones. But then if I zoom in, there's much more nuance and a lot of sort of a nice variety of mark making. And so that is great to see. And I think that attention, that very subtle attention to a shift in like the tonal range, especially on these rib cages as they kind of recede back in space, and then some of the bones in the background, that really breaks this image up in a really nice way. I think also this is a piece where the composition is much more successful, I think because you're sort of playing very consciously with symmetry, it seems, but also there's enough asymmetry to sort of keep our eye moving around the page. I think the very dramatic swoop of the spine from the top of the page to the bottom is very striking and very effective. In this image, it feels kind of similar to the last one, and there is a nice sense of movement. And that is something that I think is really exciting to see, especially in these sort of figure studies, which, you know, in a lot of art school portfolios can feel a little lazy or a little like the student working on them is maybe bored. I think we all know that we're kind of expected to have these kinds of drawings in our portfolios, and so people can kind of treat that in a very rote, kind of arbitrary way, but it's great to see you pushing that and trying to do something a little different with it. I think the repetition here, again, is very effective. One thing I would say with these figure studies in the future, even though there's a very strong sense of the gesture of all these poses, and that's another thing I love about this image, once again, using repetition as a way to differentiate and actually draw, creating comparisons between the poses. I think that is really exciting, but I think you'd get an even fuller sense of each gesture and a more clear sense of each gesture if you paid a little more attention to the placement of the feet. Those feel a little bit unresolved to me. A lot of the feet are kind of cropped out or sort of obscured by other figures, or they just feel like maybe you're not spending as much time looking at, even just observing those feet as some of the other proportions. So that's something I would really focus on. You know, the feet are generally very important to any gesture, any pose, because the weight of the pose is being placed on them. So even though they might seem like a small detail and feet can be very hard to draw, definitely make sure to get your feet in these figure studies if they're not cropped out of the image. As in this next piece where you're really zooming in, creating more focus on just capturing the specific musculature of the shoulder and the breast and the stomach. And I think your hatching here in a lot of areas is very effective. I do think that you could push that hatching a little bit further. Some of it is very broad and kind of a little less effective and a little less descriptive of the actual surface. I think especially moving up the breast, kind of closer to the collarbones, you know, the marks become a little bit more general. But I think you get really nice and specific on the arm, just trying to capture not just the musculature under the arm, but also that kind of strong highlight on the shoulder, the way that the skin is kind of resting just above the forearm, on the bicep. I think that is so specific and really great. But I like to see you sort of giving that treatment to even more of the figure. I think it's good to have some figure studies in the portfolio that are a little less fully resolved, just in terms of showing more of your process, as opposed to just these bombarding us with these perfect, tightly rendered drawings. But I think this drawing feels like it's sort of in a middle ground right now. And I think paying a bit more attention to the left side of the figure, giving us just a little bit more detail so that it feels like every portion of this figure study has been given the same amount of attention. I think that would bring this to a place where it's even more of a great representation of your process working with charcoal. Seeing you work again with a little bit different media, which is great. Seeing sort of you using colored ink and again doing a figure study that you're giving kind of a different approach to using this sort of abstract mark making in the background and sort of around the figure that conveys a sense of movement. I don't think this piece is as strong as the other figure studies. I'd love to see this approach given on sort of maybe a larger scale. I think maybe just because the way you cropped into the figure isn't as compelling to me. It feels like, especially since there's another figure just cropped right outside of frame, it feels like maybe you just cropped in on the one successful part of a much less successful drawing. And so, I'd like to see you use this ink wash a little bit more. You want to have as much work as possible when you're picking out these images so that you can sort of edit down and not have to sort of scrape the bottom of the barrel. And this definitely feels like one of those pieces where there's a lot of potential here and you're definitely hitting something very interesting, but I think you might have to take another stab at it and sort of see what comes out of that. Here, once again, very interesting stuff you're doing with the figures. I think this image feels a little bit more stiff though. I don't know, there's something about the use of the rectangular colors as a framing device that feels a little rote and kind of makes these sort of what looks like pen drawings a little stiff. I think pen already is kind of not a great media to work with unless you're actually using like an old-fashioned nib and ink, because I think a lot of these kind of ballpoint pen sketches can get very sketchy and kind of loose. I think the way you're using cross-hatching doesn't feel very decisive in a lot of these images. I think the figure on the very top left feels loose in a way that a lot of the figures don't. I would just like to see a little bit more of that loose quality in these figure studies. And then you can sort of go back in and try to bring out a more finished quality by adding these sort of abstract elements in the background. The one figure that I really love is this sort of section on the left side of the frame just below that figure with the pink background. The area below that with the blue rectangle, I love the way that we have a figure sort of overlapping that blue kind of background element, but then also we have the figure that's sort of crouching a little bit more and seems to almost be sitting on that background. I think that is something interesting that you could try and explore further in other pieces. I'd love to see those two elements, the figure studies and the kind of geometric pattern and the swatches of color sort of interact a little bit more in a more compelling way. This piece I love. I love, once again, the repetition of the figures. I feel like this kind of, to me, is sort of a nice realization of that first figure study where we see the movement of the figures, but then also some of the work you've been doing in color in the last two images. I would say maybe you could pare this portfolio down to just a couple of these figure drawings, and I would go with maybe this piece and maybe the first one. Although I think it would be great to see you just do as much of these as possible. I don't know how much access you have to sort of nude figure models. They're kind of hard to come by, but I'd love to see you maybe take this approach with even just figures you find in your everyday life. Try to do these observational drawings and these studies of movement even more, because I think this loose quality and this interest in color as well is a really nice side of you that I'm not seeing a lot of in the rest of the portfolio. So it's definitely something to include and maybe push even further. So these next few pieces are really interesting to me because of the way that you're using mixed media and seem to be working on top of photography. I think it's really interesting the use of photography because it seems like these are found images, especially in this piece where the sort of bench that this male figure is sitting on, it's so vast and sort of wide. It seems like something you might have manipulated in Photoshop first and then printed out and then worked onto in Paint. That's a really interesting approach. When I first saw this piece, I actually couldn't even tell how you did it. It took me a second to figure out exactly what was going on. So I think that is something that's really exciting to see, is this combination of photography and then traditional and digital media in a way that is fairly seamless. I think of the pieces that you included that have this sort of use this kind of technique, this first image might be the most successful. And to me, your interest in including this kind of abstract expressionist element as well, weirdly, because that's such a different sort of mark-making language incorporated with the photography, and it's almost it's almost cross-purpose, but because it's so different, it's weirdly seamless the way it interacts with everything else, and again, it almost makes the rest of the image feel like it's painted. I think this image also works well because it already has this kind of chiaroscuro lighting that speaks to a more painterly approach, and also you're so focused on the details, like that kind of texture on the bench and the wood. I think that, again, kind of speaks to this painterly interest, and so I think this piece is very successful in that regard. I would say that the figure drawings within this kind of cloud of painterly marks, that is something that I'm not quite sure about just yet. And I think maybe what would be nice to see is some of these figure drawings, these sort of line drawings, incorporated more in the background of the composition, maybe sitting on the bench next to the male figure, because I'm not quite sure right now what the relationship is between all these figures kind of dancing throughout this mess of marks, this man sitting alone in the background. So that's something to think a little bit more about. And in general, looking at these sort of mixed media pieces, I would say I think you should really think more about what exactly you want to say with these sort of macabre subject matter. I think that's something that you sort of hint at in your artist statement, but don't get too specific about. And I'd love to hear you talk more. I should say I would love to see you explore more in your art what exactly that means to you and why you're so focused on these kind of horror elements. This image feels weirdly specific in terms of the kind of like visual language you're using. Like it's not general, like it's not spooky in a general way, it's spooky in a very specific way, but not in the same way as some of these other images. And so I think it'd be great to see you kind of think about maybe inventing your own kind of mythology around this twisted world that you're sort of creating. I would suggest looking at the sort of symbolist painters, people like Gustave Moreau, Odilon Redon, even Paul Gauguin, Ferdinand Hodler are all artists that are really good at, speaking to a kind of narrative in a way that it's clear on one level, but also very mysterious. And I think that looking at some of that stuff and maybe even some Christian pre-Renaissance and early Renaissance sort of paintings that are very polemic and have like a sort of narrative function, I think that could really help you with these pieces in terms of piecing together a kind of symbolism and kind of your own personal mythology to sort of push these pieces to the next level. One thing I would say about this piece, just on a technical level, that isn't really working is that, when I looked at it, it was very hard for me to read, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a lack of depth, I would say, to the way that you're applying the paint onto the photograph. I think because you're working so much with black paint and white paint, that has really confused the depth because it's confused the strong light source of the image. The white line work in the cobwebs really makes those details pop, whereas especially in the corners of the frame, they should be receding more in the background. So that's something to definitely pay attention to. You might want to just squint your eyes and try to look at like the larger shapes of shadow and highlight and try to figure out how the image is reading that way. This next image, I feel, of these pieces where you're working on top of a photograph, this one is the least compelling. Once again, I think there's a strong interest in repetition, using the repeated, not quite symmetrical motif of the skeletons and that sort of movement, creating sort of a comparison between the two and the way that their gesture is very different. I think that's a strong element of this piece, but in general, the composition is a little not that compelling, and I think the use of mixed media is much more flat here. Again, I'd like to see you try and incorporate the paint into these photographs in a way where maybe things are overlapping a little bit more instead of just being layered in a very simplistic way. This piece, I think, again, kind of speaks more to almost a sense of humor that I think is missing in a lot of your work, or is there but not quite coming through. I think this kind of strange image that's very focused on technology and the kind of repeated visual of the brains, especially brains that are in this kind of more graphic area. There's something comical about that, even though it's very disturbing at the same time. And so I think this piece is very strong in a certain sense, but I would love to see you do more with this photograph, sort of manipulating it even further, sort of giving it your own personal take. I think also you could pay more attention to trying to look at more photo reference of brains, because these feel a little bit more like they don't feel that specific. They feel a little bit more general and almost like a pattern placed on top of each of the figures, and that kind of breaks up the sense of realism. Or at least I would say with these mixed media pieces, definitely think more about what the relationship is between the paint you're applying on the photograph and the photograph itself. Like, are these two different visual languages, or are you trying to approximate the look of the photograph with the paint? So definitely think more about your intention with that and try to make it as clear as possible. You know, maybe the paint should be a little more naturalistic in some areas, sort of looking like a part of the photograph, and then maybe in others it could be a little bit more abstract, like in this first image number 9, with these abstract marks, and then maybe incorporate some of these more detailed and naturalistic elements, like in this second piece. This sort of focus on combining mixed media is a really exciting sort of step to see you make in this portfolio. I would say, maybe there's a way to integrate your strong drafting skills and your interest in mixed media. I think that's something that you should really focus on resolving as you move forward with this portfolio, because I think that is something that could be really compelling, and I think you have enough pieces already that really show your strong drafting skills. And so I think now the next step is to kind of pare those down and try and almost integrate these different sides and these different focuses more fully, but also make sure that you're pushing each one to its fullest and picking the best work in each category. All in all, definitely something to think about what your specific purpose is and interest is in each of these different media, and then also your very clear focus on the sort of dark and macabre.